I mean, the governments are definitely doing something, right? We can see this from the Paris Agreement has
Yeah.
multiple countries signed up to reduce their carbon emissions. And kind of what I was saying is like this is backed by scientific research. They have certain deadlines. But Extinction Rebellion, are they saying, these scientists are wrong? Welcome back to Maturing Cheddar, episode 10, bringing you a variety of cross-Atlantic viewpoints from the UK and US about this weird and wonderful world that we live in. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and follow us on Instagram at Maturing Cheddar. We have Lewis, Hemel, and myself, Ryan, today, and are joined by a special guest, David. David is an accomplished jazz musician from England, has been influential in local movements in and around Bristol, and has walked from England to Palestine. He's also an advocate of Extinction Rebellion, an environmental pressure group aiming to raise awareness of climate change and the urgent need for government action on the subject. Hi, David.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing?
Yeah. Great to have you here.
You're doing well.
Good to be here. Thanks for asking me.
And you're our first guest. Hopefully,
no pressure.
No pressure to be our first guest. So today, our main subject is talking about Extinction Rebellion, and just kind of for the benefit of our listeners, especially in the US, who may not be so clued up on the subject, can you kind of give us a little explanation of exactly what Extinction Rebellion is and how you got into it and what it means for you?
So it started about a year ago from some people in Stroud, and right from the outset, it has three main goals. It's a protest. It's more than a protest movement. It wants to change from being a protest movement to being an influential, a sort of citizens' lobby of the government. It has three main aims. It wants governments, whoever they are, in the UK, it's non-party political. It wants governments to tell the truth about climate warming and not pretend there's some kind of debate about it, but draw its evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change and other recognized scientific sources, so that people are well informed and take it with the seriousness that it deserves. It's a climate emergency. Treat it as an emergency in the same way that in the phony war, this is my analogy, not theirs, but in the phony war in 1939 to 40, the public were kind of reluctant to have got involved, and it took a concerted campaign by the government to really make the public fully aware, fully involved, before there was this thing called the war effort, when everyone was engaged from government level to ordinary citizens. So Extinction Rebellion wants something of similar level of seriousness to tell the truth. But the government should tell the truth at all levels, consistently, drawing from the science. Greta Thunberg has been saying similar things. Secondly, to enact legislation, again, whichever government's in power, to reduce greenhouse emissions to net zero by 2025, which sounds like an incredibly unrealistic goal politically, but it's in line with what scientists are telling us is necessary to prevent a warming more than 1.5 degrees C, an unraveling, a complete unraveling of the system. So feedback loops mean that there's serious risk of the climate system getting completely out of control. And thirdly, something about the democratic process, that the political process and the decisions should be guided by citizens' assemblies, which have been tried in different parts of the world and even in the UK. Those are the three demands of Extinction Rebellion. And in order to raise awareness about the demands, raise awareness of the seriousness of them, they started the first sort of mass action, mainly involving street blockades, in April. Then there were regional events, including in Bristol in July, and and we're in the middle of the third sort of big level of movement, which is blockading streets and bridges, squares around Westminster, trying to occupy them. All in order to raise awareness of the goals, put pressure on the government, and move the whole thing to a much more critical phase. The whole climate debate. So it's not just a debate that some people get involved in, but it's a much more critical situation of emergency. And the part of the goal is to allow themselves to be arrested en masse, so that courts are clogged up with arrestees, and that the sort of punitive measures that the governments usually resort to are shown not to work, and they have to take the issues much more seriously. That's it, in a slightly rambling way. That's what it's about.
Okay, I think, one of the most interesting things I found when I was kind of researching Extinction Rebellion was this idea of civil disobedience as a tactic, and whether it's always the best tactic. And I know, Hamill, you have some kind of views and points on this.
Firstly, thank you, David, for joining us today. Just on the civil disobedience acts, I remember being in central London when the civil disruptions occurred, and I was at Canary Wharf Station where individuals protested by gluing themselves onto the trains. While I understand the logic behind the street blockades in Oxford Circus and Marble Arch, which for our listeners was essentially protest by Extinction Rebellion members to effectively shut down these popular areas by preventing access by cars, buses, and other motors. I thought that protests at tube stations didn't seem intuitive, given that the individuals affected were using public transport to get to their destination, which is less polluting than cars or taxis. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, David. But I will caveat to say that the general consensus from what I read in newspapers after is that for civil disruptions, as far as they go, the protesters were very friendly and generally quite well behaved.
Yeah, so the protests, they're varied. Okay, so you have generalized ones which are about blockading areas to create maximum disruption to raise the issue, so they're not pinpointing certain kinds of transport by doing that. They're blunt weapons of civil disobedience, and Extinction Rebellion recognise that this is annoying. It causes potentially hardship to some people. Certainly is disruptive. I suppose the psychological point of that is that unless your life is inconvenienced, you may not pay sufficient attention to an issue. And there's a good chance, while some people will move from annoyance to hostility, they might move from annoyance to reflection on the issue, and then to finding out a bit more about it and get more engaged. I think it can, depending on who it is and how deeply set they are in their ways, how hostile they are in the first place, it can go either way. But it's a tactic which has been proven to work in civil disobedience campaigns. Extinction Rebellion are also using more targeted campaigns. For example, they've been the last few days blockading City Airport in City of London, and that's clearly a much more targeted, focused thing, not just creating a nuisance, but highlighting the aviation as a major sector which should be drastically changed as soon as possible. The same with the third runway in Bristol. Lelsgate Airport here is a potential target for Extinction Rebellion in the future.
And David, do you agree overall with the civil disobedience method that they're using, or do you think maybe sometimes it goes a bit far?
I don't think it goes far, but I think Extinction Rebellion activists should always remember that a tactic like blockading a road is just that. It's a tactic and not the goal. Having been involved in July, and I went last Monday to Lambeth Bridge, Westminster Bridge, and just travel around the area. But it's easy to get lost in the sense of we're all having a party. Well, not exactly a party, but we're all in it together, and we're you lose sight of the inconvenience to the public because there's a lot of you, and you're creating a disruption, and then you get annoyed when the police kind of move in on you. You have to keep in mind all the time that this is a tactic, and if it's pissing more people off than it is changing hearts and minds and pressurizing the government, or worse, if very annoyed people are lobbying their MPs to say we need to improve the punitive laws to get these people off our streets, which are then used oppressively in the future, then that's counterproductive. You have to remember that it's a tactic and keep evaluating it. It's only as good as insofar as it reaches towards your aim.
Right.
So I don't think Extinction Rebellion should use the same tactic over and over again. I think it should keep nimble. It's the right tactic for now, but maybe not next time round.
It's quite interesting. I just thought, personally, I thought like there would be loads more of these, if you like, rallies and protests happening across Britain and then across the world in the next few months. It's interesting to hear that you say that the tactic should change and that the way that protests may be run could look completely different in terms of, is that basically what you're saying? Like the next time round, in your eyes, it should be a bit different.
Yes. Okay. In my eyes, I'm not an official advisor to XR. Look at street demonstrations. It's a time-honored tradition. You get out on the streets. There was a time when to do that was extremely powerful. Democracy in this country grew over a roughly 100-year period from the beginning of the 19th century to the 1920s. And in the 19th century, when people came out into the streets, that was seen as deeply threatening. The Chartists with their mass movements earlier on, the army was called, before the police were involved. The Peterloo massacre in Manchester, the suffragettes and the disruptions that they caused. These mass movements were electrifying, even as recent as the poll tax, occupying a street and forcing the government to get out there with their horses in Trafalgar Square. But then in more recent years, these street protests occupying the street has had less impact. I was involved in the 2 million strong march in 2003 against the Iraq War. And that was disregarded by Blair's government. So you have to keep thinking: is the tactic reaching its goal? Just to have people on the street to have a sort of symbolic or a ritual of, we'll occupy this or we'll demonstrate there. You need to do far more than that, which is where the three level. Let's give an example. So recently, the Labour Party has had its conference, and I'm sure that their new Green Deal, that's part of their manifesto commitment. I mean, who knows if they're going to get in power or not? But it's been influenced by the actions of Extinction Rebellion. So that's why you can't just rely on street level protests. You have to think about policy. You have to think about the democratic process. You have to make sure your tactics are right for the moment.
For our American listeners, Labour is a a government party here over in the UK. They may not know. I'm sure they do. But yeah.
A would-be government party.
Oh right, yeah.
Party in waiting, yeah. Opposition.
Yeah. Actually, I got kind of an interesting point following up on kind of the tactics and always having to develop new tactics in order to work. I have a quote here from one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam. And he's quoted saying, letters, emailing, marches just don't work anymore. You need about 400 people to go to prison. You need about 2,000 to 3,000 people to get arrested. So I think he's referring to when these protests take place, you need people to be arrested for there to be an impact. But what do you say to maybe some of the younger people who, they join the Extinction Rebellion march, they go get themselves arrested, and that could then jeopardize their future life, having a criminal record?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, look at yourself, for example. There you are, British citizen in the United States. I'm presuming you're British. Yeah. And with a criminal record, a young person wouldn't be able to go to the States. There's an example straight away. So I've read the literature produced by Extinction Rebellion on what to read if you're considering getting arrested, and it's quite explicit. It says this isn't something to be taken lightly. You have to really think through the consequences, as well as all the practical advice on what to say, what not to say, your rights, like your right to a duty solicitor or one of the solicitors that they advise. But you're quite right. It's not something that should be done lightly. The people I know who've been getting arrested are owner occupiers who may be self-employed or they're retired, so they have less to lose. They've got more privilege. So I wouldn't discourage a young person, but I would encourage them to really think through before they allow themselves to be arrested. You can't always think through. As a young person, it's not easy to think about the rest of your life and its consequences. But on the other hand, young people that I've met are more passionate and clearer sighted about the implications for them, and are willing to take the consequences. A lot of them.
But do you think there's a way to get involved in Extinction Rebellion without getting arrested? Like if you're part of let's say a team in quotation marks, and you've got like a person who's one of these people who are a bit more privileged or whatever, or less to lose, or a few of those people. But then you could have the young people who are a bit more, if you like, you use the word nimble. I'll say that they can get around. They probably travel around a bit easier. And get the message spread. Basically, it sounds like to me that Extinction Rebellion, it's got a website. It's very well organized, and it looks like there's a place for everyone there. If you wanted it, and you could deploy people in the right way, given their personal circumstance and background.
But absolutely, it's very well organized, and if you want to be involved, they encourage you, first of all, to get involved in your own area, your own town, village, city, and to join an affinity group. An affinity group is that you described. It's a team, and in the affinity group, there are people who are potentially arrestable people, and they discuss that in the group, and other people who aren't arrestable. For example, there are legal observers. Who are there to witness what's happened, to keep things calm. There are other people who are trained in de-escalating a situation when things get tense. It's a normal human response to up the ante, to get emotional. Supposing a policeman's getting a bit heavy about something, a young person who's maybe got a hotter temper might get agitated about it. It's important that in the affinity group that there are people who can de-escalate the situation on all sides, and they work as a team. They work as a team. The word nimble I was referring to was tactics, not young people. It was the movement needs to be agile in how it responds.
I got that. I just thought I'd use the word again.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think, although everyone may not necessarily agree with the protest methods they're using, it is definitely helping Extinction Rebellion to get publicity and to get followings. I mean, they were only formed last year, October 2018. I was looking on Instagram. Their Instagram group has over 500,000 followers. So I guess something is definitely working with their protest methods.
Yeah, they aim. So they're well up on the theory of how change happens. So there's a theory that you need a critical mass before to create change. You don't have to persuade half the population or everybody. You need a critical mass, and they estimate that that's about 3.5 million people. 3.5 million people are involved, from, let's say, the level of myself, who is sort of actively sympathetic, will turn up to events, but I'm not arrestable. I feel I have too many commitments to be an arrestable person, and I'm a hand-to-mouth freelance worker. I can't afford to spend the time that other people do. So there's a range of people such as myself, and then there's other people who are much more involved, who are really dedicating their whole lives to the movement. If between us, if there's 3.5 million people involved, that would be sufficient to hugely change this country. And of course, the hope is then that would be replicated elsewhere. But the need for Extinction Rebellion, the need for a citizen-led movement like this one, is perhaps less in other parts of the world, and it's certainly in other countries in Europe, because the voting system is different. There's proportional representation, which means it's more chance to have progressive politicians representing the views of the constituents in other countries than there is in the UK, which is a first past the post system, where there is a need, and why I think why XR is particularly strong here.
I think that it kind of leads on to the next point that I definitely wanted to touch on was the Extinction Rebellion's manifesto, which you briefly spoke about at the start of the episode. They have 3 main points that they want to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start with kind of the second point. So governments, they must act now to halt the biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. So I guess to everyone reading that, by 2025 to have net zero carbon emissions seems like super ambitious. And I want to know how you think they can achieve that, and whether that's kind of a realistic goal, or they're just kind of using shock tactics to get more publicity by saying that.
Well, their goal is in line with scientific evidence, the predictions. Things are getting much worse even than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been modelling and predicting. I read recently that the emission of methane from the tundra over the summer months, we're starting to get to a cooler period where less emissions is happening. It's on a scale which was predicted to take place in about 70 years' time, only a few years ago, and it's happening. It's happening now. Methane is a far worse gas than carbon dioxide. So the ambition, the target, is in line with what needs to happen scientifically. Now, whether it's politically possible, that's the whole art of politics. Significant, massive, abrupt change can happen if the government puts its mind to it. So when America entered the Second World War, within about 2 years, nearly all of its economy was focused on the war effort, because it was completely focused on that need. And we say, I'm saying we now, as kind of feeling as part of the movement. that's the level of commitment that you need to turn things around. It's a kind of war. It's a kind of, we're actually at war with ourselves as a one species on the planet. But we're certainly at war with the planet. The planet, in a sense, by shifting the climate, is trying to make the biosphere, is trying to make adjustments in line with the emission of greenhouse gases, within which the continued existence of this species, the human species, is a detail. And the biosphere is interested in the survival of life in one way or another. I mean, I'm giving agency to the planet. That's a bit far-fetched, but it's what I'm saying is we're at war with the planet, and it's like we need a scale of response. It's like the war effort. But you asked me specifically, what could the government do? Well, massive investment in renewables, number one, wind farms, solar power, which means subsidies for businesses, direct investment from governments. Green New Deal means government has to borrow for this purpose. Huge insulation program, job creation program to insulate all our old housing stock, which loses heat. Electrification of vehicles, massive investment in public transport, huge pressure on the private, alongside huge pressure on private transport systems to be diverted to public transport. You'd need less globalized, and this is one sort of funny consequence of Brexit if it happens. Brexit, in some ways, is a reaction to a very globalized world where goods, stuff is traveling one way and traveling the other way, huge distances, as if the sky's the limit. Much more localized economies could reduce the wastage, the fuel, the carbon burnt up in all this transport. And systems which are much more directly food to mouth. You're not producing food in order to feed livestock, in order to feed people. So I'm not sort of doctrinaire about this, but a much more vegetarian-based, vegan-based diet is necessary. The trends are there; they just need to be hugely accelerated. So those are some of the big ones that I think are necessary.
And what's your view on, they want to limit, air travel as well, hugely. I think there was one statistic saying, limit air travel, to once every few years, like per person, something like this.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
And Lewis, what's your view as an engineer and hugely into kind of aerospace? Do you think that's realistic, that they can just cut out and reduce air travel like that? Do you think there's a cleaner way to travel?
Well, no, there's it's exactly as David was saying. There's a scientific element to it, and then there's a political element to it. I think the scientific element, if we had a discussion in a previous episode, David, about global warming, and whether one of the points we raised was whether we think global warming is a human caused issue, or if it's, sometimes it's spouted as like, oh, this is just the earth naturally doing this, right? I think all our views were that humans have accelerated it. So if that's the case, and then the scientific view is that we need to stop, then humans can stop using air travel, and that's almost a political issue, isn't it? Because for everyone to stop, using air travel excessively, if you like, it need a political mandate for someone to say, look, you can't just fly. You need a good excuse to fly to Australia from the UK. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Rather than
Mm.
just having it free. My opinion on it. Do I think it's going to happen by 2025? No, I don't think it's going to happen, and it's kind of scary saying that because no one's got. There's a famous saying we use in like science. All models are wrong, but some are useful, and it's whether this model of global warming that Extinction Rebellion are referring to, is it useful? Is it useful in pointing us to the fact that we are without doubt warming the earth, and if we are and we don't do anything about it, it's a scary world we live in. I think so to answer your question, no, I don't think we're going to stop air travel, unfortunately. But sorry, and I've just remembered my final point I was going to make on that, which is it's actually my partner. She said, why do we need to travel? 100 years ago, people didn't travel that much, and people got along just fine, got on with their lives just fine. So what do we need to travel for? And I guess that's a question that everyone needs to probably ask themselves. No,
it's a very good question.
Yeah.
I'm a great believer in neighbourhood, and the longer I live and base myself. I mean, okay, I have done these big journeys, and I don't want to be accused of hypocrisy. I love travelling, but I'm a great believer in neighbourhood, and the longer you spend in one particular place, the more interesting, richer it gets. This is my experience of my part of Bristol, Barton Hill. I've been knocking around Barton Hill for 30 years now, and if you knock around an area long enough, the area changes before your eyes. It's not the same place anymore. Perhaps it used to be more sort of slower changing than it is now. It's completely changed to what it was when I first moved in here, and the world comes here. You don't have to travel. The people some people have to travel. Refugees and climate refugees will be travelling on a huge scale, which we believe what's going to be happening in the decades to come. So I think travelling for pleasure, for tourism, for the sake of some experience, it's questionable. So let's say that.
Well, yeah.
I don't. It's very hard now. Whether I should censor what someone else does or judge it, probably not. But I think we should develop a culture where people choose to live much more localized lives and find that those lives are rich. There's a cultural shift we need, and in the short term, you need legislation to encourage that.
Yeah, I don't think it's just going to happen organically, and I guess this is why Extinction Rebellion exists. It is asking questions. We spent at least 2 episodes talking about this now, or something similar about relating to global warming, climate change, and I'm guessing people around the world. Ryan, you did some research on this. People around the world are talking about it. So it's doing this. It's doing something. Is it going to do something on a political level? You're saying, David, that we're going to have to wait and see if Extinction Rebellion can change up its tactics, essentially, or change its strategy. In its strategy, has it got enough dynamicism? I think that's the word.
Yeah.
To keep the pressure on the government, essentially.
I think it is. I think it's looking promising. You've got to remember that it's been going just a year, and in it's not one of its 3 goals, but in order to achieve its 3 goals, the first thing it has to do is build the movement. And the things it's doing, which are bold, courting arrest, lots of individual bravery, lots of celebration, lots of strong teamwork, they're attractive. It's trying to attract a constituency of people who feel strongly about the issue, who want to do something and be active about it, and it's drawing them into itself. It's building the movement. 500,000 Twitter followers from nothing a year ago, Instagram followers.
Yeah.
Then, as it builds its numbers, it has greater clout. It's true of all movements, and it can be, it can start to influence. Politicians will take note because we live supposedly in a democracy, and they'll have to take note.
Because one of the points that Extinction Rebellion is making is the government's effectively not telling the truth. The government needs to tell the truth and declare a climate and ecological emergency.
Yeah,
and kind of in my eyes, I think the government is definitely doing something towards that. They have the Paris Agreement where they have, certain goals set by 2050 to reduce carbon emissions. And this is backed by scientific research. But Extinction Rebellion thinks, this is not fast enough despite being backed by scientific research. Do you think, the government doesn't care much for the climate, and what they're doing is not going to have an impact, and it's not going to have an impact quick enough?
Yes, that's right. It's not going to have an impact quickly enough. Well, just exactly that. It's not taking the situation with the urgency that it deserves. For example, it's possible the last few days, if the news is correct, that fracking doesn't have a future in this country. But for a long time, the government policy was what it calls a mixed energy policy. Gas, shale gas, if necessary, a bit of wind farm, nuclear. We don't need a mixed energy policy. We need rapidly a renewable energy policy to reduce our emissions. So the government is basically relies on the market, doesn't want to interfere too much, and the situation is so serious. You can't rely on market mechanisms. It's market mechanisms. I'm not an anti-capitalist, by the way. I'm a self-employed individual, and I see the value of small business, of enterprise, creative ways of doing things, financial incentives sometimes. But we're in the hands of big corporates who have vested interests in keeping things going as they are for as long as they possibly can. And governments need to stand up to that. And they haven't been. They've been listening to the lobbyists.
I mean, the governments are definitely doing something, right? We can see this from the Paris Agreement has multiple countries signed up to reduce their carbon emissions. And kind of what I was saying is like, this is backed by scientific research. They have certain deadlines. But Extinction Rebellion, are they saying, these scientists are wrong?
No, they're not saying they're wrong. They're saying the science is changing. The science is getting more urgent. The Paris Accord was already a few years, not long ago. But the situation is changing drastically before our very eyes all the time. So we need to revise our goals and make them more ambitious.
So just
the principle is right to put your policy according to the science.
So yeah, just to sorry to labour on this point, but just listening in. So the point is there, you're saying that the Paris Agreement, for example, the Paris Agreement was taken at a snapshot in time rather than looking at what it's going to be, how the science, if you like, is going to advance in 5 years' time. Is that kind of like what you're saying? So in 5 years, it's advanced so much that the Paris Agreement is already not defunct, but out of date, if you like.
Yeah, the details of it are out of date, if I understand the targets. It's too little, too late.
Sure.
That's the problem. It's the reality of making policy. You make policy, and then eventually it gets enacted, and the whole thing takes a long time. And then 5 years later, another lot get elected in, and they may or may not honour. I mean, like Trump, Trump's gone against Obama in this respect. So that's the reason, by the way, for introducing citizens' assemblies, because the citizens' assemblies can take a much more informed long-term view. And if constitutionally you build in the need to take on board what citizens' assemblies say, then you're less prone, you're less a victim to the whim of the political systems changing every 4 or 5 years.
This has been Maturing Cheddar with episode 10. Hope you have enjoyed our discussion and varying viewpoints on Extinction Rebellion. Thank you very much, David, for joining us today. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Instagram. Please leave any feedback. We really appreciate it. See you guys next week. Bye.